In 1556, Spain controlled the largest empire in human history. Its territories stretched across Europe, the Americas, Asia, and Africa. Spanish galleons carried more gold and silver than any kingdom had ever possessed. The Spanish Empire was so vast that it was said the sun never set on Spanish lands. 50 years later, Spain was bankrupt. Not struggling, not in recession. Completely insolvent, unable to pay its soldiers, its creditors, or its own government. And this wasn't a one-time event. Spain declared bankruptcy in 1557, 1560, 1575, 1596, 1607, 1627, 1647, and 1653, 8 times in a century. How does the richest empire in history go bankrupt repeatedly while sitting on mountains of gold and silver? The answer reveals one of history's most important economic lessons. Wealth is not the same as prosperity. You can have all the gold in the world and still destroy your economy through incompetence, corruption, and catastrophically bad policy. This is the story of how Spain took the greatest resource windfall in history and turned it into economic disaster, and why the lessons from Spain's collapse apply to every modern economy drowning in debt while claiming to be wealthy. Spain's catastrophe began with unimaginable wealth. After Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, Spanish conquistadors discovered and conquered vast territories rich in precious metals. In 1545, Spanish colonists discovered the Silver Mountain of Potosi in what is now Bolivia. It was the richest silver deposit ever found. At its peak, Potosi produced 60% of the world's silver. The city that grew around the mines became one of the largest in the world, larger than London or Paris at the time. Mexico's silver mines at Zacatecas and Guanajuato added to the flood. Gold came from Peru, Colombia, and Central America. By the late 16th century, Spain controlled an estimated 80% of the world's gold and silver production. The treasure fleets, the flotas, carried this wealth across the Atlantic. Each year, dozens of ships loaded with silver bars, gold coins, and precious stones sailed from Havana to Seville. The amounts were staggering. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain imported approximately 16 million kilograms of silver and 185,000 kilograms of gold from the Americas. To put that in perspective, this treasure represented roughly 3 times the total European silver supply that existed before Spanish colonization. Spain didn't just get rich, it acquired wealth on a scale that had never been seen before in human history. With this wealth, Spain should have become an economic powerhouse. It should have developed industries, infrastructure, and institutions that would dominate Europe for centuries. Instead, within a generation of the treasure arriving, Spain was bankrupt and in decline. What went wrong? Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain from 1516 to 1556, spent money as fast as it arrived. He fought nearly constant wars across Europe, against France, against German Protestant princes, against the Ottoman Empire, and against rebellions in his own territories. These wars were extraordinarily expensive. Maintaining armies across Europe required paying soldiers, buying supplies, and transporting everything across vast distances. Soldiers who weren't paid would mutiny, sack cities, or switch sides. So Charles borrowed constantly, using future silver shipments as collateral. He also spent lavishly on palaces, ceremonies, and the trappings of imperial power. The Spanish court became legendary for its extravagance. Courtiers wore clothes stitched with gold thread. Banquets featured exotic foods from across the empire. Palaces were built and rebuilt. This spending created an economic illusion. Spanish cities appeared prosperous. Money flowed freely. Imports poured in. But Spain wasn't building anything sustainable. It was consuming wealth, not creating it. When Charles abdicated in 1556, he left his son Philip II with a treasury that was technically full of gold and silver, but committed to debts that exceeded any possible revenue. Within a year, Philip II declared Spain's first bankruptcy, defaulting on loans from Genoese and German bankers. This set the pattern. Spain would receive treasure, spend it immediately on wars and luxury, borrow against future revenues, and then default when the debts became unpayable. The cycle would repeat every few decades for the next century. The flood of silver into Spain triggered massive inflation, what historians call the price revolution. Between 1500 and 1650, prices in Spain rose by 500%. This might not sound dramatic by modern standards, but for a pre-industrial economy, it was catastrophic. Here's why it happened. Spain suddenly had vastly more money, but not proportionally more goods. Farmers still grew the same amount of wheat. Craftsmen still produced the same number of tools. But now there was 5 or 10 times as much silver chasing those same goods. Prices rose accordingly. This would have been manageable if Spanish wages had kept pace, but they didn't. Wages rose much slower than prices because Spanish guilds and regulations restricted labor mobility and wage increases. The result was that ordinary Spaniards became poorer even as silver flowed through the economy. Worse, Spanish products became uncompetitive. A Spanish sword cost more than an identical sword made in Germany because Spanish labor and materials were more expensive. Spanish textiles cost more than Italian or Dutch textiles. Spanish goods were priced out of their own markets. Foreign merchants flooded Spain with imports. Why produce goods in Spain when you could import them cheaper from abroad? Spanish silver paid for French wine, Italian silk, German weapons, and Dutch ships. The treasure that should have built Spanish industry instead enriched Spain's competitors. Spain became economically hollow. It had wealth but no productive capacity. It imported everything while exporting only silver. And when the silver eventually ran low, Spain would have nothing. Spain's government systematically destroyed its own economic potential through catastrophically bad policy. First, Spain expelled its Jews in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed. The Jewish community included many of Spain's most skilled merchants, financiers, and artisans. Tens of thousands fled to the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and the Netherlands, taking their expertise with them. Then, in 1609, Spain expelled the Moriscos, Muslims who had converted to Christianity. They numbered around 300,000, about 4% of Spain's population. They were concentrated in Valencia and Andalusia, where they formed the agricultural workforce. Their expulsion devastated Spanish agriculture. These expulsions were religious and political, but their economic impact was severe. Spain lost productive members of society and gained nothing except ideological purity. Second, Spain imposed crushing taxes on its own people while exempting the nobility and clergy. The peasants and merchants who actually produced wealth bore the tax burden. The aristocrats who owned land but produced nothing paid almost nothing. This created incentive to become unproductive. Buying a noble title meant tax exemption. Investing in land meant rents without taxes. Starting a business meant taxes and regulation. Spanish capital flowed toward aristocratic idleness rather than productive enterprise. Third, Spanish regulations strangled commerce. Guild restrictions limited who could practice trades. Price controls distorted markets. Sumptuary laws regulated what people could wear and buy. Every industry faced restrictions designed to preserve medieval social hierarchies rather than encourage productivity. Spain took the greatest wealth windfall in history and built an economic system that punished production and rewarded parasitism. It's hard to imagine a more effective way to destroy prosperity. Spain's bankruptcies were driven primarily by military spending. Philip II fought nearly constant wars, and each was more expensive than the last. The Dutch Revolt, beginning in 1568, became a bleeding wound that drained Spanish finances for 80 years. The Netherlands were Spain's richest European territories, but they rebelled against Spanish rule and heavy taxation. Spain sent army after army to suppress the revolt, each costing millions of ducats. The Spanish army in the Netherlands was often unpaid for months. In 1576, mutinying Spanish soldiers sacked Antwerp, killing 7,000 people and burning the city. This event, the Spanish Fury, turned European opinion decisively against Spain and strengthened Dutch resistance. The Dutch eventually won independence in 1648, and Spain gained nothing from 80 years of war except debts and damaged reputation. Then there was the Spanish Armada of 1588. Philip II assembled the largest naval invasion force in history to conquer England. The fleet of 130 ships carrying 30,000 men was supposed to transport Spanish armies across the Channel and overthrow Elizabeth I. The Armada failed spectacularly. English ships in storms destroyed much of the fleet. Spain lost billions in modern currency and never recovered naval supremacy. The defeat didn't just cost money. It shattered the myth of Spanish invincibility and emboldened Spain's enemies. Spain also fought wars against France, the Ottoman Empire, and various German states. Every conflict required money that Spain didn't have, so it borrowed from Italian and German bankers, using future silver revenues as collateral. When Spain defaulted on these loans, which it did repeatedly, the bankers would renegotiate terms that were even more favorable to them. Spain would consolidate old debts into new bonds at higher interest rates. The debt spiral accelerated with each bankruptcy. By the early 17th century, more silver arriving from the Americas went directly to foreign creditors, then stayed in Spain. The empire was working to enrich its bankers while impoverishing itself. While Spain squandered its silver windfall, other European nations with far less natural wealth became economic powers. The Netherlands received some Spanish silver through trade, but built prosperity on commerce, shipping, and finance. The Dutch created the first stock exchange, developed sophisticated banking, and built a merchant fleet that dominated global trade. Amsterdam became Europe's financial capital. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, became the world's first multinational corporation and the most valuable company in history. It generated wealth through trade and enterprise, not through extracting gold from conquered territories. England had no American gold mines, but developed a strong economy through manufacturing, trade, and eventually industrialization. English textiles, shipbuilding, and commerce created prosperity that lasted centuries. France had some colonial wealth, but built economic power through agriculture, manufacturing, and mercantilist policies that protected French industry. French exports dominated European markets for luxury goods. Meanwhile, Spain, sitting on a mountain of silver, declined into economic irrelevance. By the 18th century, Spain was considered a backward country. Its industry was underdeveloped. Its agriculture was inefficient. Its military was weak. It had become economically dependent on France and Britain. The contrast reveals a fundamental truth. Resource wealth doesn't create prosperity. Institutions, policies, and productive capacity create prosperity. Spain had wealth but destroyed the institutions and policies that could have turned that wealth into lasting power. Spain's failure is an early example of what economists call the resource curse, or paradox of plenty. Countries with abundant natural resources often perform worse economically than countries without them. The mechanism is straightforward. Resource wealth creates several destructive dynamics. Dutch disease. Named after the Netherlands' experience with North Sea gas, this occurs when resource exports strengthen the currency, making other exports uncompetitive. Spain's silver imports made Spanish manufactures too expensive to export. Weakened institutions. Resource wealth allows governments to avoid building effective tax systems, legal frameworks, and institutions. Why develop complex economic institutions when you can just extract minerals? Spain never built the financial and commercial institutions that made the Netherlands and England powerful. Corruption and rent-seeking. Easy wealth attracts people who want to capture it rather than create new wealth. Spanish society became oriented toward extracting value from the empire rather than producing value. Reduced innovation. Why innovate when you can import? Spain's craftsmen couldn't compete with imports bought with silver, so Spanish manufacturing declined rather than improved. Conflict. Abundant resources attract wars and internal conflicts over control. Spain's wealth made it a target and funded wars that drained the treasury. Modern examples abound. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, but collapsed economically. Nigeria has enormous oil wealth but widespread poverty. Saudi Arabia is wealthy but has little productive economy beyond oil. Meanwhile, Japan, Singapore, and Switzerland have almost no natural resources but are prosperous through institutions, education, and productive capacity. Spain's silver created the illusion of wealth while destroying the foundations of prosperity. It's a pattern that has repeated across centuries and continents. Yet nations keep falling into the same trap. Who paid for Spain's catastrophic mismanagement? Spanish peasants whose real wages declined as inflation destroyed purchasing power. Spanish Jews and Moriscos expelled from their homeland. Spanish soldiers sent to fight endless wars, often unpaid, sometimes forced to sack cities to feed themselves. Indigenous Americans who were enslaved in mines to extract the silver. Millions died in the mines at Potosi alone, worked to death in horrific conditions to produce wealth that Spain squandered. Spanish merchants and artisans whose businesses were destroyed by inflation and foreign competition. Future generations of Spaniards who inherited a hollowed-out economy and centuries of decline. Who profited? Genoese and German bankers who lent to Spain at high interest and were repaid through silver shipments. They collected fortunes from Spanish desperation. The Spanish nobility who were tax-exempt and owned land that appreciated with inflation. They maintained lavish lifestyles while the productive economy collapsed. Foreign merchants, especially Dutch and English, who sold goods to Spain and received silver in payment. Spain's wealth flowed to its competitors, funding their economic development. The Spanish crown initially, until the debts overwhelmed revenue. Spanish kings lived in extraordinary luxury, even as the country descended into bankruptcy. The pattern is familiar. Elites capture resource wealth. The costs are imposed on ordinary people in future generations. And the long-term result is decline. Spain discovered unimaginable wealth in the Americas. Silver and gold flooded into the treasury. Spain should have become an economic superpower that dominated Europe for centuries. Instead, Spain spent the wealth on wars and luxury. Inflation destroyed its economy. Bad policy expelled productive citizens and strangled commerce. Military disasters drained resources. Debt accumulated until default became routine. By the mid-17th century, Spain was in irreversible decline. The silver still came from the Americas, but it went straight to foreign creditors. Spain had become a conduit for wealth flowing from South America to Northern Europe. Now look at modern parallels. Numerous countries have discovered oil or mineral wealth and descended into economic chaos. Venezuela, Nigeria, Libya, Iraq. Resource wealth funded corruption, weakened institutions, and created conflicts. Even developed nations show the pattern. Countries that borrow heavily while pointing to GDP growth often find that the debt eventually overwhelms them. The appearance of wealth, like Spain's silver, masks underlying economic weakness. The fundamental lesson is that wealth must be invested productively to create lasting prosperity. Consuming wealth, whether resource extraction or debt-fueled spending, creates illusion, not foundation. And when the easy money runs out, the reality becomes unavoidable. In 1556, Spain ruled the largest empire in history and controlled mountains of gold and silver. 50 years later, it was bankrupt. By 1650, it had declared bankruptcy 8 times. By the 18th century, it was an economic backwater. Spain took the greatest resource windfall in human history and destroyed its economy through incompetence, bad policy, and catastrophic decisions. It expelled productive citizens. It inflated its currency into worthlessness. It fought endless wars it couldn't afford. It borrowed until the debt was unpayable. The silver that should have built an economic superpower instead enriched Spain's enemies and creditors while leaving Spain hollow and weak. Resource wealth without wisdom is not blessing, but curse. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same. Spain's bankruptcies weren't accidents or misfortune. They were the inevitable result of policies that consumed wealth rather than created it. And every modern nation running deficits while claiming prosperity risks learning the same lesson Spain did 400 years ago. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.